तुम्हें तकलीफ में हूँ 2 घंटा और 1 घंटा क्या बोली कैसे रखने का फिर रख के बता दे भाई नहीं रख के तो बता तुम लोग में तो खा सकते हो क्या खाते पीती रही पानी
Remote students, can you mute, please?
Hey Mohammed.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Is it a good time to ask a question or once you go over it?
Go ahead. You can ask a question.
I was just trying to make sense of the muted video. So basically, I was reading the lecture notes and then trying to see the video, and I have a confusion in terms of there is a line in one of our the PDF document that says that yes, constructor cannot be inherited. However, when you create a subclass from a method that has a constructor, and then the subclass has a constructor, and when you call that subclass, or like basically when you make an object from that subclass, the constructor of the parent method gets automatically invoked. So how did that happen in our the dog and animal
Yeah, no, it didn't automatically
example?
get invoked. I think maybe the wording is not completely up to the point.
Yeah.
What happens is, like, let's say if you have a parent constructor and you inherit that class, the subclass has subclass must create its own constructor and call the parent constructor, so to speak, and that's when we use the keyword super, right?
Yeah, because the parent class has the three main variables, name, size, and weight. And in the subclass, we had the three variables, and on top of it, we added like additional variables.
Right.
And then in the immediate next line, we call the super method to pass down the three variables.
Right. So you're kind of combining, right? So you're kind of the way a method works is that you don't have to do anything, right? It's already there for you. You just don't see it, right? So it's kind of invisibly available for you. Whereas with constructor, it's not invisibly. I mean, you're still inheriting it, right? But you have to explicitly say it using the keyword super. So yeah, so that's kind of the way it works.
So when you use the word super, so in the parent class, the this dot name value it gets set to the whatever constructor.
Yeah, so when you say super, it invokes the parent constructor. And if you don't do it, then it'll keep having that error when you inherit the class that has a constructor.
Okay. And the other question was for the abstraction, like when you inherit a class. I mean, you cannot inherit. I mean, like when you use the abstract class. So if that abstract class has a a constructor, so the subclass it forces you to have a constructor.
Yeah.
I was not sure why would that be.
Well, it makes sense, right? You're inheriting something. Again, that concept is the same. If it has a constructor, you must have to invoke the parent one, but they want you to explicitly do it. It's not automatically done.
Okay.
All
Thanks.
right. Okay, let's get started, everyone.
Quiz?
No, we'll do quiz a little later. I'm pretty anxious. So we had couple of, I mean, this homework is the only one that was a little bit challenging, I guess. How many of you were kind of like, were you able to make sense out of this homework? The customer, deleting account, and all of that. Yeah. That was good, right? So it was a bit of, so sometimes this is called system design or whatever you want to call it. So a lot of time you have to make these decisions of where to put what, how is it one related to other, and the most importantly, putting logics together, making things work. So now your loops and arrays has to kind of support your methods, right? So it's not just system out every time, you're actually implementing stuff. So we'll go through the same requirement again and see what we make out of this, right? So if you look at our homework was, so when opening an account, customer must enter user ID, minimum 3 characters long. It cannot be one which is already taken from the user ID list. So I don't know if I covered the first step, but that's fine. That was the easy one. So yes. So what we look at customers, we're validating user ID, right? So very first thing you want to first maybe set, and maybe this could have been done other ways, and some of you guys probably did it. But since the requirement was that it must be entered, so either you could create another method, call that method inside of a constructor, whatever. That's one way to think about it. But you can actually do all of the implementation within the constructor itself, right? So I think, Nirmal, I think you're not muted. Are you? Somebody online is not muted. Just double check, Deepak. So we initially set it to contain is contains equals to false, right? Just to see if my values are contains against false. And then say, okay, just go through the IDs. So that's the reason I kind of gave you these IDs. I mean, you could push another one inside of it, but that wasn't the goal, but if you did it, that's extra credit, I guess, right? So you just go through each IDs, and if any point, if the user's ID is equals to the user ID that you're taking from the customer, right, we will turn the switch to true, right? We'll flip the switch and turn it into true. And then we just kind of simply do a check. If it doesn't contain, then only you want to set the value, right? So if you had the user, so let's say if you're trying to use a username that's called foo, then in that case, it will never turn true, and then this condition will never get executed, and by default, your user ID will be null, right? Which is fine. And whenever a programmer sees a null, that means it was never set, okay? So that was the first logic. The second one was to verify a password, right? And a couple of things. You wanted to make sure the length was greater than 8. You wanted to make sure it matches an alphanumeric pattern, and also make sure that it doesn't contain the user ID that you've selected, right? So those are the three things, and you could pretty much put all of it in one line. So first you're checking password, length must be greater than 8, right? And password matches this. So we have not gone over regex, and we're gonna go over when we get to Selenium and Cucumber. But what this simply means is, and I wanted you to kind of Google a little bit, and this could be done in many other ways. Like you can actually go through each index, iterate through ASCIIs and all of that, but that's not something I want you guys to go through in this class. So what this simply means is that, hey, whatever the password is, it must have accept anything that has lowercase a to lowercase z, and then uppercase a to uppercase z, and then 0 to 9, and it must kind of include the numeric and the letters, right? So the numbers and letters. So that's what pretty much what and it could be any of that. So the star means okay, and as long as 0 to 9, anything that matters, right? I mean, as long as this person enter any of the value, that's fine. As long as user enters any of these values, that's also fine. And if that matches, then your requirement kind of met there, right? And then finally, you're saying, well, you want to make sure the password doesn't contain the user ID that you just selected. What's up?
I have a question about this acceptance rule. So basically, the special characters as a dollar sign also will be accepted, or
No. So you see this caret sign here? That
Yeah.
means it starts with, right? And what this dollar sign means, my regex ends here. So every time you see a regex, you're gonna see those two. That's kind of like, okay, this is where the regex started, and this is where the regex ended,
okay.
right? So it has nothing to do with the computations.
So if we want to use the special characters in the password,
So it has to be inside of this, right? So you probably put hash this, that, all of that.
Oh,
Okay. So you have to, I guess, list all of them, or maybe there is a one value that covers all of it. I'm not sure. But this has nothing to do with it. But that's a good observation, right? So this means that's where my regex ends. You had a question?
That was my question.
All right. And then if this condition is true, then I will set the password. Otherwise, we'll just give a warning saying invalid password. All right. Finally, I think the last one was to check the number 3. Once the account is created and initial balance is set, user should be able to withdraw money from their account, right? So that's another one. Withdraw was pretty easy actually. So you had the withdraw amount, but then you can kind of just put the logic here, right? If the amount is greater than balance, system out amount exceeds your account balance, right? Otherwise, we are going to do the logic balance equals to balance minus the amount, right? So that pretty much takes care of your withdraw amount. And then right after you withdraw it, you might want to see your account balance, and you can kind of get that back here, right? This is just some divider to make sure that text is printing out correctly. Right. The last one was to pretty much delete the account, right? So this one is a little bit more complex because you just have to think a little bit, right? Outside the box, you have to mess with a lot of arrays and the reason I wanted you to do this because we are gonna start doing this very easier way after today's class, right? And if not today's class, Monday's class. Once we learn how to do with array list, but before you know how to do it easier way, it's very important you understand how array works. And this is one of the exercises that kind of helps you understand that, because once we do array list, this exercise becomes few lines, right? So very first thing what we really need to know is keep track of our account IDs, right? So the most important thing is we need to somehow figure out a way to keep track of the account IDs, because that's the only way we can hook on an account object, right? Account ID would be assigned to an object, so to speak, right? So very first thing what we had to do is we had to create a class data, right? Because when you think of list of IDs, individual ID belongs to you, but the list of ID belongs to the bank, right? Because that's all of their customers' IDs. We could make this dynamic, but we didn't want to go through writing the entire code base. So let's assume our bank can only have 5 customers, right? That's the max amount of customer that this bank can have. And we created this array, and we know that our account IDs are string. So that's the first thing. So make sure these data types are string, right? And then what we had to do is, how do we set the account ID? Well, there's two things you're checking when you're setting the account ID. Remember, these indexes are sort of dynamic, right? So let's say I know the size is 5, but which goes in what indexes, right? So, and then when do we set them? So by initially, all of those values is going to be set to null, but every time account is created, we have to fill those slots in with the new account ID. But account ID needs to be mapped to an index. So what are those indexes? So what we really have to do is here set account IDs. First, you need to find out is the account created or not, right? So let's say we find this out. If the account is created, then only you want to deal with deleting it. If the account was never created, then there's nothing to really delete here. And then your account ID, just your simple account ID that we need to deal with. What we are saying is, while account is created, means as long as this is true, I want you to set the account ID's next ID minus 1. That will be your index position, which is B0. All right? And then equals to the account ID. So this will, remember, next ID always increments 1. But once the account is created, next ID goes to the next number. So we have to bring it back, right? So what we do is we subtract 1 every time. So if the next ID was 10, the index would be 9. So that's why we have to kind of do this. But this kind of gives your index values, right? And then we have to set this account ID, its account created, to false, because now you already kind of added that, and you have to have a false statement to come out of the while loop. Otherwise, this becomes a infinite loop, right? And then you have a public static, and these are static, so they're not really part of the object, they're part of the class. And you have a static string get account IDs, and this will give you the list of account IDs, all right? I know it's a lot going on here for some of you, and that's totally fine. What you have to do is really study this, understand it, think about the requirement, go back to the requirement and see what the requirement was, and then look into the implementation. And this could be better, right? You can iterate after every class. You can go back to these homework exercises and continue to iterate, continue to make it better, right? But in real world, that's kind of what you see. Every method is going to have some logics. It's going to deal with some loops. It's going to deal with some arrays, some math here and there that you have to deal with. It's not just system out. That's the kind of the whole point of the exercise, to show you that we are not just system outing stuff in a real world. And then you come into the delete account. So there's a bunch of logic here. This is what we are. So first thing you want to find out is account created. So what I have is I have another switch here. When I say switch, I don't mean the other switch. It's more of a Boolean statement here saying is account created, right? So every time someone creates an account, like add account, and I actually turn the switch on to true, right? So if the account is created, then we will turn it into true. So if the account was ever created, then you can delete it. So the very first thing you want to check is account created. If the account was never created, there's no point of going through the entire logic, right? So if the account is not created, you'll just say invalid account, right? But then you want to kind of iterate through the entire list now, right? So whatever the list, let's say you have those 4 users that you have, you go through each one of those, right? And that's what our account.getAccountIDs is keeping the kind of the ledger, right? Keeping the book of all the account IDs, right? And once we go through the account IDs and we're saying string each one, and we say account IDs, first of all, you want to make sure they're not null, right? Because if it's null, there's no point of checking that, right? So if it's not null and account ID equals to the user accounts ID, whatever the one we just kind of assigned to that user, which is here, somewhere here. As I was right here, acc.getAccountIDs, right? So if it's equals to that, so this is the part you cannot build just yet, right? And that's fine. So this is where I just system out saying removed account ID, acc get account ID. What we do in real world is that we'll grab this account ID, write a SQL command, right? Go into a database and find everything related to that account ID and just remove the row from the database. It's really not moving it from the code because the code doesn't hold anything, right? So it's going to go into a database, find all the related information on that table with that account ID, like let's say balance, this, that, all of that, and we'll remove it. I know some of you guys, what you did is you resetted the names, you resetted the balance. So that's excellent. That's the right approach. But in real world, we're just gonna go into, it'll just be another line of code like this, and just say go into a database and then remove that all the data associated with that ID. Right? Vishal, would you mind closing that door? No, the other one, I think. Yeah, thanks. Any questions? So for those who have done this, I think it's making sense a little bit, right? If you have not done it, please go over these implementations and take it from there. All right? Okay.
Could you share this?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I'll share it at the end of the class. Now, what I want to kind of go over. So this is a very important topic, which is exception handling. Every language has it. So what's an exception handling? An exception is a problem, right? It's kind of an error that occurs during program execution. Exception,
I didn't get that.
So exception handling, yeah, well, it is an error. So exception handling is a powerful mechanism that handles runtime error and maintains normal application flow, right? So think of any type of errors that happens to code. Like, you guys seen something like null point exceptions yet? Have you guys seen that yet? So null point exception is something, or think of like you're calling a folder or a file from your system to read the data inside of it. One possible error can happen is that two possible can happen is that the file is not there, right? So you're calling a file that's not there, and then you can also call a file that is empty, right? So these are two possible errors that can happen. So when that happens, what do you want your programs to do? So what happens? Situations like that, program just shuts down, right? So you have to handle it. Like, if this happens, you want to maybe display a right message to a user, or give, or maybe route the code into a different direction. Maybe look for another file, like a backup file, since the primary file was not there. So there's so many scenarios that can happen, right? So situations like this, how do we handle it? And that's always going to happen. So for instance, one of the requirements going to be for you when you doing the Selenium work is that you went into a web page and you're looking for a button, like let's say a submit button, it's not there, it's going to throw an exception called no such element found exceptions, right? So what do? Your program just shuts down. But what I really want to do here is that when that error happens, I would like to take a screenshot of the page, right, and attach it to my report. Mm-hmm. So things like that, how would you do it? You have to do it through, because as soon as an error happens, everything stops. Your job is to, when that happens, you either ignore the stop, continue to move forward. You want to continue to move forward, but you also want to capture the error, right? Because that's very important. Or maybe log the error into the server, right? Or maybe when anything like that happens, maybe send an automatic email to your whoever the QA team members or whatever may be the case. So I'm just showing you like a lot of different scenarios where you can run into this, and that one of those is that you're gonna see a lot. So user has entered invalid data. A file that needs to be opened cannot be opened, right? Maybe you don't have the right permission or whatnot. A network connection has been lost in the middle of communications, insufficient memory, and other issues related to physical resources. So one of the so when you run an infinite loop, right? And you get this exception called Stack Overflow exception. I don't know if you guys ever ran into that yet, right? And you know the site called Stack Overflow, right? So that's how it kind of came about. Stack Overflow means whatever the memory that your computer was Java was allowed to allocate from your computer as far as memory goes, because of infinite loop, it covered all of it, right? There's nothing more to there's no room for it. So that's the Stack Overflow, right? So memory outage, so to speak. So these are the kind of exception you can run into. Well, you're probably not gonna run into Stack Overflow exception, but if you run into any type of exceptions, you have to handle them, right? And it's not like if else logic, right? So there is a special mechanism to handle those types of exception. There are two types of there are two exception types: checked and unchecked, also called runtime. The main difference is that checked exceptions are checked when compiled, while unchecked exceptions are checked at runtime, right? What is the difference between compile and runtime before we even talk about exceptions? Can someone explain that to me? What is the word compiled means in the context of Java? Yeah.
Overall time for all the processes.
Sorry?
The time that adds in every time we run the process, it shows like overall time for all the process. This is my guess. I don't know really.
When you're writing your code, it keep on checking if there is any mistake or there is any, like it shows the red out, like the underline if you're missing a brace or something.
Okay, that's good,
That's
right? So,
compile time.
and what's the run?
When we run it and we got the exceptions, like when we run the for loop, sometimes it comes like out of bound exception.
Okay, good.
That's runtime. When it runs, and it goes to that exception.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So compiled is when your code, like whatever code you've written, and you hit the save button, right? And it kind of compiles into a bytecode, so to speak, whatever, right? And then it's kind of prepping for to run it on the machine, so machine can understand it, right? So there's a two-layer: compiled, and then there's runtime. Runtime is when you are actually running the code, right? So there are some errors or there are some libraries, they know like what are the possible exceptions that can happen in specific scenario, right? So if you're dealing with like files, so two possible or three possible thing can happen here is that file may not be there, file cannot be opened, or file is empty. So if we can guess those, we can predefine those exceptions, and when you're writing the code, before you even run it, we can give you an error or like kind of like a warning saying, hey, what do you want to do here? There is a possible exception that can happen, right? It's like, you're going out, right? And it could be a rainy day, and we can tell you, hey, there's a chance of rain today. What do you want to do? Do you want to take an umbrella or not? You have the option to, get wet or take an umbrella. So I think the code also tries to do that. Like if we know what are the possible, then there are specific requirement that is only belongs to your company, right? So there's not much we can do on that, right? So let's say that you're doing some math or some sort of reading inside of that file that only belongs to your company. So I can't like the Java or anybody who wrote those libraries, they can decide that for you. So those could be your runtime exceptions. So you run into an issue when you actually run the code, right? So there's two type of exceptions: checked and unchecked, right? Exception can be caught using combination of try and catch word. Okay, so let's try. Let's try building those now, and then we'll take it from there. No, just call it a sandbox or something. So the way you do it is, so let's say int num1 equals to 0 and num2 equals to maybe 62 divided by num1. Leave it out. So let's try running this code. So there is an exception happened, right? And it's called, the type of exception is arithmetic exception. You can divide a number by a 0. So this is not something a compiler can tell you, or they have not built that out for you, right? So this is a runtime exception. This happened when the code actually ran, right? But then if you had, let's say something like, file, right? And this, let's just say it's at users Mohammed file.txt. Let's say I'm looking for this file, and then I want to read this file, so I'll say file reader file equals to new file reader. So you see how this one's throwing an error? It's not really an error. Well, it is an error. It's telling you, hey, you have an unhandled exception, possible unhandled exception here. So this is called checked exceptions. The compiler is allowing us to, reminding us that, hey, there is a possible exceptions here. And you have two options, right? And then we'll deal with these options a little later. What we do with checked exceptions. But let's stick around here. So when this exception happens, how can we handle this? When this happens, let's say I want to take a screenshot, or I want to send an email during this kind of errors, or I want to log this error into the server, right? So when someone is, so let's say a customer calls and say, hey, I can't pay my bills, right? I hit the button, but it's not really going into any account, but I get an email notification saying the amount was deducted, right? This stuff, things that people freak out, so they call. So when that happens, how can you figure out what happened, what went wrong? So let's say they made now 3 payments. They just keep hitting, every time they're hitting the payment, they keep making the payments, right? So now, let's say $300, $100 each, $300 got deducted from their account. So you have to handle scenarios like that, you have to log all of the user's actions. So anything that you do on any of the apps, believe me, it's all logged, right? So Jishan's like, oh my god, I didn't know that. But then, so when you think of any of those apps, right? That's pretty much how all of those Facebook or Snapchat, and that's how they make their money, right? They look at this user's behavior, they study this data, and then they market this crap to the companies, right? So this is when we have to really handle exceptions so we can understand what's happening if an error type, that type of error happens. So what we do is we'll say, I guess, is it going to generate? No, it's on. So you'll highlight this, Command Option T. So you do Command Option T to open this up, right? So you can actually write, if else and all that stuff, but let's just do this one. So try catch. You see where it says try catch? So we'll click this, right? I don't worry about this right now.
Can you repeat the combination? Command Option T.
So it's, I'll just put it here. Let's see.
Mohammed, can you please show us how you create a try catch?
Yeah, right here. I just put it here.
I have Windows.
Oh.
It must be more shift.
So all right, let's focus on this. So now we wrapped our logic around something called try catch, right? So we're saying is try this code, execute this code, and when you execute this code, there is a possible options of getting an exceptions, right? By default, you get these generic exceptions. This one is not good. Every exception that we see arithmetic exception, no such element exceptions, stack overflow exceptions, file not found exceptions. All of these exceptions are derived from exception class. So you see, like when we had an animal, right? And then you have dog, and then you have a bunch of other things. So they're just giving you a generic animal here, so to speak. So when you try to really specify the error, it's not gonna kind of behave the right way, right? Because it's just saying, okay, hey, it's just an animal, but what type of animal it is, right? That's what's important. So how do you know these things? You might say, well, I don't know the 1,000 exception. Well, when you hit the error, you kind of grab it from there, right? So you grab that, dump it into your catch, right? And then you can kind of, and you see where it says E print stack trace, right? So when this error happens, everything related to this error is stored into this local variable called E. Make sense? And then anything related to the error, we can kind of print out. So the most common one is print stack trace. What print stack trace means is, give me the Java files that kind of, got invoked during this error. So it gives you the lines, the very first line where the error happened, and then goes back to the original root level of that error. In our case, we're not really dealing with a lot of classes, so you're just gonna see one line which says sandbox Java 8, right? So it points out gives you the entire tracing of that error, right? You can trace the entire error where it kind of happened. So that's what the print trace does for you. But even if you don't want that, I mean, I recommend obviously you want it, but you can also customize your error, saying So now you can kind of just print anything you want to print, and let's see what happens. So your error message looks a little bit more cleaner. So now you have more control, right? So in this case, let's say when we actually doing automation, and let's say your element is not found on the screen, that means you caught a bug, right? So you might want to take a screenshot and log a ticket or whatever. You can write scripts for every little things, and you can say, take screenshot, right? And then you can say, attach it to report. So obviously you're gonna have a method that does that. We're gonna build those methods and so forth and whatnot, right? But for now, let's say you want a custom message as well as print stack trace. We can do both. Stack trace tells you which line the error happened, right? And error kind of gives you a little bit more descriptive error, more user friendly, so to speak. Any questions? So question is, what if the error doesn't happen, right? So we have a valid division here. Then nothing happened. I mean, your division actually went through. This code never gets invoked, right? But this is kind of your backup code. Like when an error does happen, what do you want to do, right? So now if you go back to our code, where it says invalid password, we can just throw in exceptions. We can say throw new unsupported. We can create our own exceptions and throw it during that time. If someone were to enter an invalid password, you can say, hey, your password must contain all of those things. So it's more descriptive. If you want to shut down your code at a certain point, it's this is how you do it, by building exception. So the level of work that you guys are going to be doing, you don't have to build an exception, but you have to handle them. So you're not going to custom. That's why we're not going to learn how to build an exceptions, but how do you handle them? That's what's important. Okay. So when you go to an interview, say, hey, did you ever build an exception? Just be honest. No, we have not built an exception, but I know how to handle them when they come around.
Can we use without try? Without try. It's try means something if we print some code.
Yeah.
Yeah. Without try.
Results?
No, without try.
Without try?
Yeah.
I mean, no, you can. No, it has to come with try and catch.
Okay.
I mean, what's the point of trying it if you're not going to catch it, right? Like there's no, doesn't mean anything. So it has to come with try catch.
So it's basically we need to know what kind of error message we are looking
Yes,
for.
you have
so
to.
we are trying something.
We are trying. We are not. I wouldn't see it as the way it's describing it here. What you're doing is I am executing this code, and during this execution, I may have a possible error, which is arithmetic exceptions. And when that happens, I want you to give me these details. Make sense? So let's do another one. So here's the question. What if you have two errors? There might be a line of code that has possible 2 or 3 or 4 possible exceptions that can go wrong, right? So in that case, so let's think of something like this. Int calculation array SSL. Right? And now what I want to do is I want to say calculation on index 7. I would like to store whatever is I'd like to. Right, let's get rid of this number. And let's try running this code. So even though the first exception, I mean the arithmetic exception is fine because 30 divided by 2 is a valid, this is valid is division, but you have another exception now, array, index, out of bound exceptions. The size is 7, but it's always the last value is the size minus 1, right? So we're trying to put something that doesn't exist. So let's say you have 7 boxes and you're trying to put it on 8, right? So it doesn't make sense. So there's another exception is an array index out of bound exception. So you might be asking, well, in that case, I want to print out more valid message, right? Or better text trace. So you just have to keep adding catches, right? So you add another catch, and in this case, we know what type of exception. So they're all come from the family of exceptions. So just using a generic exception, it's not a good approach. So you might want to be more specific to what your exception is. And these are all data types.
Everything's going to be stored in
No, that variable could be anything, but by default, that's kind of the standard, right? It's just like any local variable name, right? Stack trace, and we can say right. So now, if we run this code, we can get a little bit better message, right? We get the stack trace as well as the message warning array out of bound index exceptions, right? But if you have the valid one, that's fine. So just like that, you can keep adding different ones, have a custom error, and so forth. But then here's another question. What if there is a scenario where, think of like a database, right? We open a connection to a database and something went wrong, right? And yes, I got the message and all of that things is fine, right? But the connection kind of left open, right? So when you try to connect again, now the door is already open, you can't open it again. So it's going to start giving you error, right? Because the tunnel is already kind of open. So what we want to do is no matter what, there is a piece of code that needs to get executed. Either it's success or fail. Make sense? So there might be a scenario where it's so important to run that, close that connection, right? Regardless it passes or fails, I always need to do something, right? So in that case, we use another keyword right after your final catch. It's called finally, right? And this code base is saying, let's say, close all connection. And the very, very good scenario is this. Let's say you open a browser, right? You open a browser and you trying to, let's say you didn't find a button or something like that, right? You caught the exception, you took a screenshot, you did everything you had to do, but then you run another test, it's going to open another browser, right? So now you have two browsers, right? And your code is single threaded, means it's a single instance, so it doesn't know which one to work with. So now it has two of them available to it. So we always have to, regardless if the test passes or fails, we have to bring the browser down so we can open up a new browser and do the next scenario and so forth. Make sense? So when you run into that kind of scenario, we will use some, well, we have better ideas, but for now, you will use something like finally, right? So the finally means no matter if the scenario, so in this case, there is no exception, right? But you will see the finally block of code always gets executed. Close all connections. Make sense? These ones are pretty simple. All right, so these are your checked exceptions. Now let's move on to the unchecked exception ones. Well, sorry, these are the unchecked ones. This is your checked exceptions. So when a checked exception happens, you have two options. You have an options to throw it or catch it, right? So throw it means, hey, I understand you're trying to notify me, but I get it. I don't care, right? I'm just going to keep throwing this, right? So you can kind of go here and it'll say add exception to the method signature, right? So when you do this, yes, that means you acknowledge the error and it's going to put this exception here. Since this is a main method and no one's going to call this, it's fine. But if you did this to one of your sub method, like let's say in customer class, like in add accounts, you throw an exception. Anyone who gets this, they're gonna get the same error. Hey, you have an exception. What do you want to do with it? So you have to keep throwing them until. So in my opinion, I think it's always better to handle it at one location, right? So the other people doesn't have to deal with it. So in this case, you can kind of just surround it with and automatically builds this out for you, right? So you're surrounding your code base that has possible exceptions. Make sense? So try catch, I mean, it's a pretty simple stuff. You don't have to go crazy over this, as long as you're kind of knowing what's happening. That's all that matters here. Let's go through the definitions a little bit. So a catch statement involves declaring a type of exceptions you're trying to catch. I just want to read this so I'm not missing any type of requirements. If an exception occurs in the try block, a catch block will follow the try check. So it's when you read it, it's more confusing than it's actually helping you, right? So in theory, just go through this. Once you kind of get feel for it, play around with it a little bit, go through this requirement, and they're also not mentioning about finally and all that. So there's throws. Throws means, again, you acknowledge the checked exceptions, right? And you're just throwing it to the method. It's somebody else's problem, right? That's what throw means. Catching it means, okay, you took the ownership of it, you're handling it. And maybe certain cases you might have to throw it. Maybe you want to kind of, whoever kind of the end user, at that point, they're going to handle it, right? So it's all depend on scenarios. All right, any questions? Before we move, we're gonna move on to array list after the break. So we'll take a break, I guess.
Throw example. How we can throw.
We went over it, right? So you see when the error happens?
Yeah.
You see this bulb, and you just say add exception to the method signature.
It means automatically.
Yeah, it will automatically throw it for you, right? Any questions from online?
It means we don't have exception. So we don't have problem, yeah?
Sorry?
It means we don't have problem. What's the problem?
No, that means you understand that there is a possible problem and you just don't want to handle it right now. Someone else will take care of this. I think everyone online's here. Oh well, I didn't forget about it, don't worry. We'll get the quiz right after this one. After this one, I'll assign the homework. and then we can do the quiz and you can go home. Right.
Party still going on.
You guys are coming?
Really show us how to interface like the methods with the clients, how to use them with the clients or not. Is there someone else?
No, that's not the class for it.
Who does not the customer, but who does it? Like the programmer developer does it, or the designer does it? Who does it? Like,
No, everything's done by a developer, but it's a different type of developer. Right. All right, so we know how to deal with arrays, right? But we've already seen the problem with the array that we have, right? It's hard to it's hard to increase the array. So like, let's say you have to kind of predefine what the size of the array is and all of that. It's hard to find out which index has what store, where the index is. So it's kind of a pain, right? So Java has, I guess, they came up with this solution called arraylist. Think of a list, right? It's just array is also a list, right? But this is a type of an object. Arraylist is a type of an object that deals with list, right? So arraylist provides a number of useful methods to manipulate its object. So the add method adds a new object to the array list. Conversely, the remove method removes an object from the array list, right? Example. But this comes from another library, right? Someone has built this out for us. And then you're going to create array list in this fashion. And then you see how colors.add. You don't have to specify index and then set the value and then set the value, all of that. So what we have to do is, and then when you print this out, you kind of just get all of that list. But what I really want to kind of go over is they're kind of pretty much talking about the same thing here. Let's start building an array list, and then based on these examples today, your homework's going to be a little bit challenging, but that's okay. You can do that. But some people say it's easy. They want more work, so it's not bad. We can do it in sandbox, I guess. Yes, I am. So the way we do it, sorry, what was that? Audio on? Yeah, it is. Actually, what happened was I upgraded my operating system, right? And that's when the tool that I use, it was I had to go into it and enable, like allow them to, so I just had to do that.
So this.
Yeah, so you see how we have array list, and then we have to open an angle bracket, and then close an angle bracket, and then specify the data type inside of it. What will be the data type of this array list would be? Again, you still cannot mix match them, right? If it's going to be a string, it's going to be a string. So list equals to new array list, right? And then you just kind of keep adding items, right? So we can just say list dot. You see, now you have an option to do whatever you want to do with it, right? So let's say if you want to add an item, you can say, I don't know, color, right? Let's just say red. Colors dot add yellow. Dot add And if you kind of just want to display everything from the array, you can just kind of do this now. So, and just print out the list, right? The concept they use here is called toString. We're going to learn how to build that later. So you see how you got the array in a square bracket, red, yellow, blue, black, so forth. So
But in arraylist there is no square bracket.
what do you mean? Any arrays is going to have a square bracket beginning on. You just may not see it here, but under the hood, it's still using the same array that we've been using, right? So if you look at how they build this, you can see this stuff, right? Ultimately, it's cloning on some other list objects, and you can go crazy looking at it. But I will always root back to how the original array was built. Everything kind of came from the same source. All right. So let's say if you want to find out the index. So based on the color, you want to find out which index is it storing at. Maybe you want to kind of move around a little bit, right? So if you want to check the index, so we can say int index position equals to, you get the list, and let's say index of, I want to find out the index of blue, right? We'll say blue.
So index
Right, so index of blue is, what is it? 2, right?
So because of two, like index position always input, right? It's not string.
Yes, because, and the way I know the return type, it's not just that I know the index position. It tells you, right? So when you say index of, and it tells you the return type here, right? Let's continue. What's up?
Is this array somehow different from the array with the curly braces?
Yeah, I mean it's a different object, right? So even though it's called array list, it's like they wrote in a lot of code to make sure that it's more is, you can think of this way. It's another way of handling list. Okay, I don't want you to get confused with the arrays that we've been learning. Everything that we deal with is the core concept is how do we handle list, right? So the way we learn is the traditional way of doing list, but now we're just learning another way of list, dealing with the list, right? Yeah, I know the name kind of says, oh, it's an array list, right? It is an array list, but it's not. It has really nothing to do with how we've been actually working on it, right? But what we really need to understand is that, hey, this is a new form, a new way, easier way of dealing with list. So I can add an item, I can remove an item, right? I can find out the position of an item, I can switch them from one position to, I can find out duplicates. So it's a lot easier to deal with this type of an array list than the traditional one that we have, right? You can also find out Boolean is find out if the list is empty or not, right? So you can say list dot is empty. Now, doing that with the traditional array, it's a lot of work. It's not so easy to find out if the list is empty or not. So that's kind of what you can do. Find out list. You can also find out obviously the size, right? So int size equals to list dot size, right? So this will give us how big this array is. In this case, it's 4, right? It's the same as length. And then you can also, this one is pretty cool, right? You can say Boolean is element this equal to, we can say list dot list dot contains, and let's just say we want to find out if black is part of my array. Now imagine how we did it for the previous work, right? So I wanted you to do that so you really understand how things work, right? We could have skipped that whole exercise and come to this, and it's just one liner tells you if it's there or not, right? But you have to understand from fundamentally how this thing works. Otherwise, you're not gonna be an engineer. You're just gonna copy code and do work, right? But that can only take you so far, right? You're gonna hit the ceiling really quick. But when you really understand how thing works, you can break things in pieces and put it back together. Okay, now you're you know, not just career, you're gonna enjoy your work, right? Because you're not worried about losing job. You're not worried about getting paid. You know, those things are gonna be taken care of for you. You know, so I just hope that that's what you guys have an ambition for. Otherwise, it's it's a tough career, right? I mean, you'll have a job. Everyone's gonna have a job, but it's something do you really enjoy it, right? And then you want to find out, let's say, getting an element in a specific position. So you can also get element by index. So what this one did is that it found which index has my value in. Now we can do opposite. Passing the index value, we can get the actual element value, right? So we can say something like this, string, because again, the reason, and we can call it color equals to list dot get, and you specify an index, right? So let's say 2. So this will also get me 0, 1, 2. Blue will be stored here, right? So let's say if you wanted to retrieve all elements from an array, right? One by one. Let's say I want to retrieve each one of those, right? Obviously, there's two ways. We can go back to our original way of writing a loop, right? Int I equals to 0. I is less than list dot size, okay? And then I plus plus, and then you can say color is, and then you just print out the I, right? Oh, it's just, it's going to be list dot get I, right? Because that was just getting the indexes, and this is going to get us the value inside of the indexes. So now your color is red, yellow, blue, black, right? But you might be saying, well, why are you writing it like this? You can do it much easier way. String color, and then you put list we already have color on scope. Let's just comment this up. Okay. And then now if you just do give me the color, it'll do the same thing. So you have two lists now, right? So red, yellow, blue, black. So you just have a lot more flexibility now. But the ones I really want you to understand is that, let's say if you want to replace an item, right? Because that's what your grocery list is going to be, right? You bought an item, now you want to put it back, right? Or think of shopping online or something, right? You bought something, you want to put the, get them out of your cart. So how would you replace an element? So you have to do something like that. You want to set list dot set. So you want to see when I mention set, it says, hey, you have to pass in which index you want to replace and what will be the new name of that value, right? So we'll say set. So let's say we want to replace index number 2, right? Let's say you don't like yellow. So in that case, it'd be 1, and the new color would be brown, right? So now if you go back and print your array, then we can go 4 and after. Okay. So before we had red, yellow, blue, black, and now we have red, brown, blue, black. So it's easy to replace an item. So think about it. First, if someone were to tell you, hey, I want you to replace the color yellow, right? You have to do a little bit of thinking here. First, you have to find out which index is yellow sitting on, right? Because I don't really know where it is. So you have to use this thing. We have something like that right here, right? Index of. So first, find out, you get the index of, and then you find your index, and then you go through, use the set, pass in your index here, and update the new value, right? So it's not everything not out of box. You still have to do your coding and compositions. Okay. Now let's say if you need to remove an item, obviously it will be similar, right? You can say list dot remove, and let's say I want to remove a 0. Okay. Then we can also run this again. So brown should be your first index now, right? The 0 index should be because it kind of shifted or unshifted. And then you can also remove item by name as well, right? So list dot remove, right? And then I think we can do brown. If we run our code, you should only see blue and black, right? So now only you have blue and black available for you. I mean, these are the top ones. For homework, so this is kind of just sandbox, we're playing around, but the homework is going to be serious. So what you have to do is you do the homework, and we'll come back Monday and we'll go over it. But before we get there, let me assign you the homework first. It's pretty straightforward, right? It's pretty easy.
Today you didn't say it was going to be fun. You said it's going to be serious.
Are you not enjoying it? Okay, so this is the homework. And then let me just assign you first. So when user runs this app for very first time, prompt user with below message, right? You want to give them like an instruction of how to use this app. So if they press 0, print the choice of options that you have available. If they press 1, to print the list of grocery items currently you have on the list. If they press 2, to add an item to the list, now you can add a new item to the list, and we'll test all this out. If they press 3, you can modify the item in the list. If they press 4, you can remove an item from the list. If they press 5, to search for an item in the list, right? You need to search for it to see if you have it already. And number 6 is meant to quit the applications, right? So based on the choices user makes, app should perform actions accordingly. So by pressing 0 option, key should. So this is pretty much what is kind of describing it here. Nothing really special, right? So now let's, I mean, the requirement is easy, but implementation is a lot of code actually. So what you have to do is, right? So it's saying, okay, what do you want to do here? So let's say I would like to add an item. So what do I select? So now it says, please enter your grocery item, right? So I'll say apple. Now you enter the choice again, right? So I want to add another one. So please enter another grocery item. Right? You can use scanner. Well, I don't know if yet. That's up to you. Right? So now it says orange. So now you have 2 items on your list. So now we can mess around with those 2 items. So let's see, we want to maybe get the list of that, right? Bam, we get an apple and orange on our database, right? So now you want to maybe modify an item, right? So let's say number 3. So enter the item number, which is what? Let's say we want to modify orange. Nobody likes orange. So enter the replacement. Right? So now you replaced your item. Let's see the list again. So we can say, oh, let's please enter the grocery item. I'm gonna replace apple again, right? And I would like to. 2 was to enter something, right?
Yeah.
All right. So let's get the. What does 1 do for us? Actually crushed. There's a bug because it cannot take a value, right? So in this case, if that happens, you just you just stop this, right? And we can start over again. So this way, you can kind of just pretty much see everything that you want to see. So let's say number 6 will be the quit the applications. It will process ended, right? And if that one is going to be tricky. So let's see how you do it. But nothing that we have not covered. So there's nothing new. It's just that breaking things into pieces, right? It's pretty much everything that we cover. So you have to use a little bit of an object-oriented, right? Move things around, get them together, and then print all of the stuff that you need to do. And then if you want to run it again, right? You want to find out if the application is empty. Yeah. So I don't have this implemented. I would like for you to actually implement those 2 as well, right? So this number 7 and number 8 is not implemented, but that's kind of I guess an extra credit. I don't know what the credit is, so but that's. Any questions? I mean, do you understand the requirement? How do you do it? That's up to you. Everybody understand online? So allocate enough time to work on this. I'm going to share this file with you in a little bit. But that's about it. All right, if there's no questions, let's start on the quiz, and then we can call it a night. We covered a lot of items today, so. Um, try not to use any notes or anything, right? Just try to answer it based on what you know.